Christmas dinner had always been a big deal in our family. The kind where everyone dresses up a little too much, pretends like everything's fine, and piles their plates like it's the Last Supper. I showed up with my usual quiet smile, holding a homemade pie no one would probably touch, but it felt like the right thing to do. I took my seat at the far end of the table like always. The same spot they gave me every year, like they didn't know where else to put me. We were halfway through the meal when my brother stood up and tapped his glass with a fork. Everyone fell silent, forks paused mid-air, wine glasses still in hand. He looked right at me and grinned, that smug kind of grin that tells you trouble's coming. "We took a vote," he said loudly, making sure even the kids could hear. "And you're not Mom's daughter anymore." There was a beat of silence, like even the walls held their breath. Then laughter. Loud, unkind laughter. My sister clapped. Someone actually whistled. And Mom? She just smiled and sipped her wine, like this was the kind of entertainment she'd been waiting for all night. I didn't say a word. I just reached into my coat pocket, pulled out a small USB drive and held it up between my fingers. "Calm as ever," I said, "then you'll love what's on this." I walked over to the TV, slid the USB into the port and picked up the remote. The screen flickered, then lit up. Their laughter stopped. Their smiles died all at once, like someone had flipped a switch and drained every drop of joy out of the room. It's strange how even as a child I could feel the difference. I couldn't explain it back then, but I always knew I wasn't like the rest of them. My brother and sister, they were loud, bold, always taking up space like they were born to be loved. And they were. Mom lit up when they entered a room. Her voice softened, her eyes brightened, and she gave them this effortless affection like breathing. But with me everything felt measured. Conditional. Earned. When I brought home good grades, I got a nod. When they brought home trouble, they got hugs and excuses. My brother once punched a hole in the wall during a tantrum and Mom said, "Boys will be boys." I once cried after being bullied at school and she told me to toughen up. "You're too sensitive," she said. I heard that a lot growing up. Like being affected by things was a flaw I had to apologize for. I learned early that if I wanted peace, I had to create it myself. So I became the one who fixed things. When my sister locked herself in the bathroom screaming over some teenage drama, I sat on the floor outside her door until she calmed down. When my brother lost his job and stormed out in the middle of dinner, I was the one who called him later just to make sure he was okay. When Mom got quiet and cold after one of her moods, I was the one who cleaned the kitchen spotless and hoped she'd smile at me again. I wasn't just the middle child, I was the glue. The one who remembered birthdays, who filled in the gaps when someone dropped the ball, who made excuses for them so the family wouldn't fall apart. But the thing is, glue gets overlooked. No one praises the glue. They only notice it when it's gone. There was always this unspoken rule. Don't rock the boat. Don't ask too many questions. Don't challenge the way things are. And for the most part I didn't. I stayed in my lane, did what was expected. But sometimes late at night I'd lie awake and wonder why I had to try so hard to feel seen. Why love in our house felt like something you had to earn, and no matter what I did I was always coming up short. As I got older I started to notice other things. Little slips. Inconsistencies in stories about when I was born, where we lived, who was around. Once during a family gathering someone made a joke about how I look nothing like anyone. Everyone laughed. I laughed too, but inside it stung. I brushed it off like always, but those comments started to pile up over time. There was a photo album I found in the attic once. Old pictures, mostly of my brother and sister. Pages filled with birthday parties, family vacations, messy faces with cake and balloons. But I wasn't in most of them. And the ones I was in felt off. I was usually in the background, off to the side, like someone had remembered to include me at the last second. I asked Mom about it once. She looked at me and said, "You were always so quiet. You never wanted attention." But that wasn't true. I just learned not to expect it. The resentment crept in slowly. Not the loud kind, but the quiet ache that lives just under the surface. I resented how they leaned on me but never stood up for me. How they expected me to carry everyone else's burdens but never asked how I was doing. How I could disappear from a room and no one would notice. I used to think I was imagining it, that maybe I was just too sensitive like they always said. But the older I got, the more I realized. It wasn't in my head. It was real. So I kept showing up. I kept doing what I'd always done. Because I thought if I stopped, maybe the whole thing would fall apart. Or maybe they'd finally see what I had been trying to give them all these years. But deep down I knew. I knew that no matter how much I gave, it would never be enough. Because I wasn't enough. Not for them. And even though I never said it out loud, a part of me had always wondered, was there a reason I felt so different? Was there something they weren't telling me? Something they all knew and I didn't? That question stayed with me for years. Quiet. Persistent. Like a knot in my chest I could never quite untie. Things had been building up for a while before that Christmas dinner. Looking back, the signs were there. Small things that didn't seem like much at the time, but together they told a story I hadn't wanted to read. It started when my life began to settle in a way theirs hadn't. After years of struggling, of putting everyone else first, I finally began focusing on myself. I got a good job. Moved into a place of my own. I wasn't rich, but I was stable, and that peace I'd fought so hard for started to show. I smiled more. I stopped jumping to fix every little crisis. I created boundaries. Simple ones at first, like not answering late-night drama calls or politely declining when someone wanted to borrow money again. That's when the shift happened. My brother, who once used to joke that I was too soft, suddenly started calling me cold. My sister, who had no problem venting to me for hours, said I'd changed. Even Mom began making little comments like, "Don't forget who was there for you when you had nothing," which was ironic considering I could barely remember a time she ever truly had my back. The phone calls got shorter. Invitations came less often. When I did show up, there were whispers, half-finished sentences that trailed off the moment I walked into the room. I caught my name in the middle of conversations that didn't include me. They'd switch topics too quickly, smile a little too wide, and act like nothing was wrong. But something was. Then, a few weeks before Christmas, I found out what had really been going on. I was visiting an old family friend. Someone who had always treated me kindly, someone who didn't play games. We were sipping tea when she looked at me carefully and said, "You okay? Heard there was some kind of family vote." I blinked. What?" She looked surprised. "You don't know." My stomach dropped. She didn't have all the details, but she'd heard enough to know that my siblings, and possibly even my mother, had talked about me behind closed doors. That they were deciding things, trying to draw lines, as she put it. I didn't say much after that. I just nodded and smiled like it didn't shake me. But inside I was spinning. The more I thought about it, the more pieces started falling into place. The way they'd been acting lately wasn't random. It was deliberate. They weren't just pulling away, they were cutting me out. Silently. Like I was being erased from my own family without a word. I kept my distance after that. I didn't ask questions. I didn't confront anyone. I just watched. Paid attention. And every interaction felt more strained. The fake concern, the sarcasm hiding in compliments, the way they shared jokes I wasn't in on. It was like they were testing me, waiting for me to break. But I didn't. I smiled. I nodded. And I made a plan. Christmas dinner was the final act. When my brother stood up and made that announcement, when he said they took a vote, it wasn't a surprise. Not really. I already knew they'd decided I didn't belong. They just finally said it out loud. What they didn't know, what they never imagined, was that I came prepared. They thought they could turn the page without me, like I was just a chapter they were done reading. But I had my own story to tell. And they were about to hear every word. I didn't plan on digging. That's the thing about secrets. Sometimes you're not even looking and they still find their way to you. It started with a DNA test. One of those kits people use for fun around the holidays. I got it as a gift from a coworker, just a joke really. "Let's see what kind of mutt you are," she laughed, handing me the box. I almost didn't do it. But something in me, maybe curiosity, maybe years of never quite feeling like I fit, pushed me to send it in. A few weeks later the results came. And that was the moment the ground under me started to shift. There were no matches to my so-called siblings. None. Not even distant cousins on their side. Instead, I found connections to names I didn't recognize. People from a different region, a different family tree entirely. I thought it was a mistake. So I called the company. They confirmed the results were accurate. It didn't make sense. At first. Then I started remembering little things. Things that never sat right. I remembered how my aunt once slipped and called me her friend's baby. How my birth certificate looked like it had been reissued when I applied for my passport, even though I was never adopted. I started to question everything. So I did what I'd never done before. I looked. I searched. I went through old documents, photo albums, drawers at Mom's house when no one was looking. That's when I found the letters, stuffed in the back of her closet, buried under a pile of old tax forms. They were from a woman I'd never heard of. The handwriting was shaky, the ink faded, but the words were clear. They talked about missing me. About trusting her to raise me right. About being grateful for the chance, but also scared I'd never know the truth. One line stood out more than anything else. Please tell her one day. She deserves to know where she came from. I sat on the floor, clutching those letters, feeling like the world I knew had cracked wide open. My mother, if I could still call her that, had lied to me my entire life. I wasn't her daughter. I had been taken in, hidden in plain sight, raised in a home where I was never meant to belong. But that wasn't the worst part. As I kept digging, I found more. Bank statements. Legal documents. Quiet transfers of money. Inheritance funds that had been left to me by a relative I barely knew existed. Funds that were drained over the years. My name had been replaced by my brother's on one of the accounts. The handwriting was clearly Mom's. They'd stolen from me. Not just affection, not just identity, but money. Opportunities. The future. There was even more in the hospital records I managed to obtain. I requested them using my real birth name, something I discovered in one of the letters. That's when I saw it all laid bare. My birth, my placement, my transfer. It wasn't legal adoption. It was informal. Off the books. A secret agreement between two women, one desperate and one calculated. I couldn't breathe when I read that. I carried all of this for almost a year before that Christmas dinner. I told no one. Not my friends. Not my therapist. Not even the kind neighbor down the hall who I talked to more than anyone in my family. I held it in, trying to figure out if exposing them would bring peace or just more pain. But the moment my brother stood up and humiliated me, publicly erased me, I knew the decision had already been made. That USB? I held it all. Scanned copies of the letters. Side-by-side DNA results. Financial records. A short video I recorded explaining what I found calmly and clearly, like the adult I had to become in the absence of any real parenting. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just laid out the truth. Their truth. My truth. And as the video played on that TV screen, the room turned to ice. No one moved. My brother's face drained of color. My sister covered her mouth. Mom didn't blink. She just stared at the screen, frozen, like if she didn't move, maybe this would all disappear. But it didn't. They weren't just looking at evidence. They were looking at the mirror I'd held up to them after all these years. And they didn't like what they saw. Holding on to that secret was one of the hardest things I've ever done. But I waited for the moment when it would mean something. When it would matter. Not to hurt them, but to finally stop hurting myself. Because sometimes silence protects no one. Sometimes the only way to reclaim your voice is to make sure it's heard, even if it shatters the room. For a moment after the video ended, the room was completely still. No chewing, no murmuring, no clinking of silverware, just silence thick enough to choke on. It was like the air had been sucked out and all that was left was the truth hanging between us like smoke. I didn't look at anyone right away. I let the silence sit. Let them absorb it. Let them feel the weight of what I'd been carrying alone all these years. Mom was the first to react. She didn't say anything at first, she just stared at the screen, her face pale, her lips pressed so tight they were nearly white. Then her hand trembled as she reached for a napkin, pressing it to her mouth like she could wipe the truth away. And then just like that, the tears came. She didn't cry like a mother grieving. She cried like someone caught. Her shoulders shook and she whispered something. I couldn't make out the words, but she wouldn't meet my eyes. My sister was next. That's not real, she snapped too loud, her voice cracking. Anyone can fake papers. You probably found that stuff online. But even as she said it, she was shrinking back in her chair. Her bravado didn't match her expression. Her eyes were wide with panic, darting from me to Mom, back to the screen, then to my brother. And my brother, he didn't say a word at first. He just sat there, jaw clenched, his hand gripping the edge of the table like he was holding on for balance. Then finally he stood up and pointed at Mom. You knew, he said, voice low and sharp. You knew this whole time and said nothing. Mom didn't answer. Did you take the money? He asked, louder now. Is that why you kept her? For the damn money. That's when the finger pointing started. My sister turned on him. You're the one who got her inheritance account. Don't act innocent. They weren't just shocked, they were unraveling. Decades of lies, jealousy, and quiet resentment all spilling out at once. They weren't arguing with me. They were turning on each other. And I just stood there still and quiet watching it all burn. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I didn't need to. Because for the first time in my life I didn't feel small. I didn't feel like the outsider begging for a seat at their table. I felt free. I picked up my coat, slipped the now empty USB back in my pocket. I looked around the room one last time, not to make a point, not to rub anything in, but to say goodbye. Not just to the people but to the role I'd played for so long. The peacemaker. The fixer. The forgotten one trying to earn her place. I walked out into the cold December night without a single word. And you know what? It didn't feel like leaving. It felt like coming home to myself. In the days that followed I didn't get any calls. No apologies. No explanations. Just silence. And for once it wasn't painful. It was peaceful. I didn't chase anyone. I didn't try to fix what was broken. I'd spent my whole life doing that, gluing cracks that didn't belong to me, smoothing over wounds while mine stayed open. But this time I chose something different. I chose myself. I started with boundaries. Not dramatic ones, just clear. I blocked the numbers that only reached out when they needed something. I stopped checking social media to see what they were posting, whether they were pretending like nothing happened. I didn't care anymore. That chapter was closed. But I didn't isolate myself. I turned toward the people who had always shown up for me, quietly and consistently. The friend who brought soup when I was sick. The neighbor who left flowers at my door on my birthday. My coworker who checked in when I looked tired. They weren't related to me by blood, but they treated me like I mattered. Like I belonged. That was family. I started rebuilding my life, not from scratch but from a place of truth. I went to therapy, not because I was broken but because I deserved to heal. I started saying yes to things that made me happy and no to the things that drained me. I traveled. I laughed more. I made space for joy. And slowly I realized, I wasn't grieving the loss of a family. I was finally letting go of an illusion. To anyone watching this, maybe you felt what I felt. Like you have to earn your place in your own home. Like love is conditional. Like you're never quite enough. Let me tell you something you may have needed to hear for a long time. You don't owe anyone your peace just because they share your DNA. Blood might connect people, but it doesn't create love. Loyalty, kindness, respect. Those are the real foundations of family. And if you've been told you're too sensitive, too distant, too different, maybe you're just finally recognizing what doesn't fit. It's okay to walk away from people who hurt you even if they raised you. It's okay to choose yourself. It's not betrayal. It's survival. I didn't just lose a family that night, I gained clarity. I learned who I was without their shadow. And let me tell you, she's stronger, lighter, and finally free. You deserve that too. If you've ever sat at a family gathering and felt like a stranger, if you've ever given your heart to people who only saw you when they needed something, if you've ever wondered, is it just me? I want you to know, you are not alone. Family can be a beautiful thing, but for some of us it's complicated, messy, painful. Sometimes, the very people who were supposed to love us unconditionally are the ones who left the deepest wounds. And when you've lived through that kind of betrayal, especially later in life, it can feel isolating, like everyone else has some perfect close-knit family you somehow missed out on. But here's the truth, you didn't fail. They did. And knowing the truth, even when it hurts, is what sets you free. It gives you the power to stop trying to fix what you didn't break. It allows you to stop shrinking yourself to fit a place you were never meant to belong. I shared my story not for revenge but for release, and in hopes that someone out there, maybe even you, feels a little less alone today. If you've been through something similar, if you've had to walk away, if you've had to choose peace over people, I'd love for you to share your story in the comments. You never know who it might help. Let's make this a space where honesty, healing, and real connection matter more than appearances. Because at this stage in life, we're not here to pretend anymore. We're here to live fully, love wisely, and finally put ourselves first. And that's what real freedom looks like.